So I want to take you back, way back to 2004. And that's 11 years ago, and hopefully I don't look it, but I was 20 back in 2004, and that was when I was really first starting to build websites professionally for other people rather than making GeoCities websites for myself. So 2004 was the year that Facebook was founded. IE6 still held the biggest market share of any browser on the web, and BBC Sport website looked a bit like this. So as you can tell just from this image, it was quite a long time ago. Now, my workflow back in 2004 was quite different to how it is today, and it consisted of something like the following. So I'd write some HTML and CSS. I might write some JavaScript, but back in 2004, we weren't using JavaScript like we do today. I might just use some DHTML and put a marquee tag in there, go a bit crazy. And then I'd use FTP to upload files to a server, and that was it. Website built, job done, brilliant, right? This workflow was amazing. It was so simple. Except it wasn't quite as great as it kind of seemed. A bit like this invention by these two clever chaps. It had some flaws which weren't immediately obvious, although this should be immediately obvious to them. So, for example, companies that I worked for back then didn't use version control. SVN had only been invented in the year 2000, and Git was nowhere to be seen in 2004. So our version control was having copies on our local machines and then uploading that to a copy on the server, which looking back is pretty dumb, right? As companies like GitHub have come around and made version control a lot more accessible for developers, no matter how they work, everyone now expects to use version control, and for a really good reason, right? But version control isn't the only thing that's progressed since 2004, and front-end development in particular is moving at an absolutely insane pace in that time. Our workflow now involves all manner of choices, and much like the cogs in a watch, they need to fit together to make a really cohesive process for your team and for your project, and no matter how big or small that team may be as well. Now, for me personally, problems with process I've found have been accentuated dependent on the scale of the project. So larger scale projects with longer shelf lives tend to show up the flaws in the process a lot more, because you tend to find that the choices that you make get tested more over time, right? So it kind of makes sense. But that doesn't mean that smaller projects don't benefit from good process as well, because it's all about how, if you've got smaller projects and you're working on smaller time frames, it's all about having a process in place that's easy to get up and running with, and consistency across projects. So it's different reasons for that process. It's all about weighing up those choices for you and what will be most beneficial for you, and making sure, crucially, that you don't put things in place that will hinder you further down the line. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the front-end tools and methodologies that I think offer the most value to teams today, and I've found to have the biggest impact in terms of the structure and maintenance of the projects that I've worked on. So I'm going to focus on a few areas. I'm going to talk about CSS, because it's such a big building block of the web, and some of the things that I've noticed to help me when authoring CSS, so preprocessors, methodologies, and naming schemes. I'm going to talk about task runners, so grunt and gulp and that kind of thing, and why I think they're a great idea. And I'm going to talk a little tiny bit on static site generators and just how I use them and how I think they're useful for things that might not be immediately obvious, but also for things that are, it's kind of built for as well. So I want to start by going through some of the things and the changes that I've seen in a language that I've always worked with. And for me, no matter how much it can get stick sometimes from people, moaning about CSS, CSS is absolutely one of my personal favourite languages. Although this is apparently what the logo looked like originally for CSS, which I was quite amazed at when I Googled it, because considering this represents all of style on the web, I think you'll agree it does a really good job of doing that. Now, CSS is really expressive. At its core, it's deceptively simple. But the more experience you gain using it, the more intricacies you tend to find. Now, unfortunately, when starting out with CSS, it can feel a bit like this. And hopefully everyone's seen this, but you can't do a CSS talk without putting this GIF in, really. I'm just going to have a drink of water while you enjoy this. Now, this is how I used to feel when I was developing for IE6. I still obviously feel it when I'm developing for older Android browsers and that kind of thing. And as my experience with CSS has gone on, I do get this feeling less and less. But this, when I first started working with CSS, was a feeling that I got all the time. Now, if you, like me, you've been developing websites for some time, you'll know just how far CSS has come in a relatively short space of time with CSS3. Now, I'm going to sound quite old here, but times were tough back before CSS3. We were being forced to make rounded corners out of images and fonts out of things like Cipher and Kufon. So those who haven't worked with Cipher, It was basically Flash for fonts, which was amazing. These were awful times, and I've got massive therapy bills to prove it. But we're finally now getting to a place with developments like Flexbox and web fonts, where we can almost do anything that we want to in CSS. But we're still not quite there yet. We're always going to have specs being fleshed out and browsers waiting to implement things that we want to have. So how do we mitigate for this in the meantime? Well, the obvious answer is to use preprocessors, CSS preprocessors. So out of interest, how many people here use a CSS preprocessor in their workflow? That is awesome and kind of expected, but great that everyone is almost everyone seems like they are. And preprocessors are really mature now, right? Lots of developers are using them, which is great because they're extremely useful. I actually did a survey about a month ago on front-end tooling in which 2,000 people replied to it, which is amazing. And one of the questions I asked was on CSS preprocessors and what CSS preprocessor they use. And 85% of people who replied used a CSS preprocessor now, which I think just goes to show how mature they are as a tool and how important they've become to be in terms of front-end development. I think now if you're going for a job, this is expected. It's quite easy to learn Sass and stuff, but it helps now if you know one of these tools because it's easy to port between them. I know for myself personally, they are a tool that I would genuinely find it hard to live without. But what are the benefits of using a preprocessor? So I know that all the hands went up, so I know I'm preaching to the converted a bit here. But I wanted to highlight the things that I think are the absolute killer features of preprocessors. So forgetting nesting and mixins, which are really handy when structuring CSS, I think there are a few main reasons to use a preprocessor, in my opinion, above all else. So the obvious ones, like file organization is a massive one. Just being able to break up your CSS into multiple chunks, so component-driven CSS, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second, is really, really crucial. And if nothing else, this was amazing when I first started using Sass. Variables are another one that are hopefully obvious when you start using a preprocessor, but just being able to obviously have major breakpoints defined that you can then set across all your media queries, and then if you want to change them later, you can change one variable and it'll just intersperse throughout your CSS. I think one of the more features that I've used Sass, that I've used more and more, is actually having full color palettes in variables, and just being able to have that and not having colors just dispersed throughout your CSS so you don't know what colors are being used is a really handy feature in variables, especially when you come to use stuff like style guides, which again I'll talk about later. One that's obviously gained a hell of a lot more traction, but hopefully everyone's using this, but one of the key things that I use it for now is for browser prefixes. So in vanilla CSS, you obviously have to specify and maintain fallbacks for browser prefixes yourself, which is okay, but obviously you have to maintain that. It can easily become redundant as you stop supporting browsers and that kind of thing. So this is like a transition browser prefix, right? So I'd have to define all of this for older browsers, and this is similar for transforms and keyframes and lots of older older support. Now, with a preprocessor, you can use mixins, which is, a lot of people used Compass for that, which was great at the time. But now there's actually a tool called Autoprefixer, which a lot of people have started using. Hopefully everyone here is using it. But it basically means that you can write CSS like this, which is just a standard CSS selector. And sorry, not a selector, just a style. And it'll automatically, if you give it a list of browsers you want it to support, it'll automatically go and look up those prefixes and add them when it's compiled, which is absolutely awesome. You don't have to do anything. Autoprefixer just does it all for you. And the other thing that I've started doing a lot more recently is inline images using post-CSS assets. So I'll talk about post-CSS in a second, but this is something that isn't in Sass. I think it was in Compass that you could do this, but basically rather than have multiple images just by using URLs, which are obviously different, more HTTP requests, which you want to kind of minimize in CSS. You can use data URIs. And the problem with data URIs is that a lot of people convert them and just put them straight in their CSS, and that's a nightmare to maintain. You don't have an original image file, or if you do, you don't know where it is. So changing that image then later can be a problem. Now the good thing about this is that you can use the inline keyword, which is what the plugin gives you, and you specify the image, and it will automatically generate that on the fly as you compile. So I know that if I want to change that image, I'll go straight to that image and I can update it. Or if I change that image, it'll automatically change when I compile, which is awesome. Now, Autoprefixer and post-CSS assets are actually plugins for a different kind of processor, and that's a tool called post-CSS. Post-CSS is a pretty new tool. It started to gain quite a lot of attention because of Autoprefixer, which has really kind of gained it some momentum. So has anyone here used post-CSS yet? Anyone heard of it? Okay, a few people, cool. So PostCSS is really cool because it's labeled as quite different to traditional preprocessors like Sass and less. But if you've never heard of it before, what's the main difference between something like this and Sass or less? So preprocessors have a ton of features. So you choose to, say I wanted to start a project and I chose to use Sass. I get all of the features that Sass gives me, which is great if I'm the only person working on it. But if I have a full team of people, including juniors, and I might want to control the features that they can use, because there are some features in Sass that can be quite dangerous. But the problem is I can't turn them off. So I either have all of Sass or none of Sass. Similarly, if I wanted to extend Sass at some point, I can do that with pull requests. I can try and get it into the main Sass repository, but that's kind of controlled by someone else. So I can do all of that work, but they might not want my feature to ever be a part of Sass. So extending it isn't as easy as it might be if I was using another tool like PostCSS. So PostCSS is completely the opposite. It kind of flips the idea on its head. So imagine with PostCSS, you start with no features, and everything is added with plugins. So if I wanted variables or nesting, I can add a plugin that does that separately. So I can build up the feature set that I want rather than have all of the features at the start. So this is quite a powerful thing because say I don't want to have the extends functionality in Sass, which I think is quite dangerous in the wrong hands. I can actually even just not have that. So I can just add the features that I want, which is awesome. You can also write your own, because everything is plugin based. If you want to add a feature, you just add a plugin. You just write your own plugin, plug that into the compile step, and it will do it all for you. So that's why this ecosystem has kind of grown, is because people are building plugins for it, and you can go and choose the plugins as and when you need them, which that's what we've done in terms of choosing like PostCSS assets, and Auto Prefixer is one of those plugins as well. So essentially, you can create your own unique preprocessor out of PostCSS plugins with as much or as little functionality as you actually require. Now, if this sounds too good to be true, it is a tiny bit at the moment, just simply because it's such a new technology. And like any new technology, the plugins are being built by people, and so not everything is quite there yet. We looked at using it as a straight swap for Sass at Just Eat, but it doesn't have quite all of the functionality that we require. But that doesn't mean that it won't be right for your project. If you just use variables and nesting and that kind of thing, all the plugins are there to do that. So if you're looking for a much more lightweight alternative to something like Sass, this is definitely worth looking at, and I'd definitely recommend everyone go and check it out because it's got quite a lot of momentum in the community right now. So in summary about PostCSS, it's a pretty new tool, which means that there is a limited number of plugins at the moment. I think this will grow, and obviously if you've got time to build your own plugins, this is totally a really cool tool to kind of help extend as well. But it does have a ton of potential, like I say. The creator of Bootstrap, Mark Otto, actually even, I'm not sure if it was jokingly, but he mentioned that he would potentially build Bootstrap 5 in PostCSS. That's how much momentum it's got and traction, it's kind of attention it's getting. So taking a step back, we're always looking to achieve these three things when we write CSS, I think. So structure, maintainability, and flexibility. And using a preprocessor helps us reach these goals when they're used responsibly. But there's always a massive but, right? So it's when we use them responsibly, which is the word that's most key in that last sentence. When we use tools like preprocessors, we've got to make sure we don't end up like this dog. We end up just going, oh my god, shiny features, amazing. Because I've seen like people use mix-ins which are like basically incomprehensible to anyone else. And there's no point adding complexity for complexity's sake with a preprocessor. The idea is that they're meant to simplify stuff and meant to help you with features, with your structure and your maintainability, like I'm saying. For example, this was a legitimate piece of code that I came across when I inherited a project from a freelancer at my previous company. I hope everyone can see that. But if they can't, that's a nested piece of CSS 9 levels deep, which is awesome. If you ever write this, I would slap your own head. My initial reaction to this was something like this, where I just wanted to die inside slowly. But the problem with this is this kind of makes me as sad as when I was using stuff like Cipher, because this is completely self-inflicted code, right? This isn't hacks that we have to do. This is people not understanding, right? And it's not that they're not understanding the preprocessor. It's not the preprocessor's fault that they're writing this. It's that they're not understanding component-driven CSS. And if they knew about methodologies, then they wouldn't be writing stuff like this in the first place anyway. So this is what it compiles out to. And like I said, if you ever wrote a selector like this, you just don't deserve to be writing CSS in my mind, to be honest. So keep your selectors short and clear so that they're more extensible and reusable. So as a general rule, anyway, things shouldn't be nested more than 3 levels deep. But I'll go through some methodologies in a moment that as you if you learn about them, you shouldn't ever be getting near that level of nesting anyway when you look into component-driven and modular-driven CSS. Another often abused feature, probably my pet hate one, is extends. And I completely get that there are times when people can use extends and it's useful, but it's probably the most abused feature that I see in Sass. So this is an example of an extends, someone using extends. So you've got font weight bold on a button, and then you've got a button inside a header. So I make that color, I want to make it red, so I give it color red. And then I make another button down the line, and I want to extend my base button, and then I want to write some more styles on that button with the base styles that my original button had. Now the problem with this is that because I might have thought, I'll just inherit the font weight, I won't inherit everything else. But this actually compiles out to inherit everything. Now, as you can imagine, if you've got lots and lots of different dependencies on that button, you will then inherit all of those different references of it throughout your entire project. And the CSS this can create is absolutely horrendous. I've seen some really beautiful uses of it over some of the projects that I've worked on. The better way of using extends, if you actually really, really do want to, is to use placeholders. And this way you can make a reference to the original button as a placeholder, like with the percentage sign. And then when you extend it, you actually do just get the base reference rather than all references. So it's a really good way of just extending the base component that you want to. I prefer extending stuff with classes just because it fits more into the kind of ideologies like methodologies that I'll go through in a minute. But I get that there's completely, when you're using CMSs sometimes, this is a really useful way of hooking into classes that you might not always have control of. So use preprocessors responsibly. Only use them when they help with structure and maintenance. The good thing about preprocessors is if you don't know Sass or less, you can just write CSS, right, and it'll still work. So you can just enhance it as you need. So just use them to enhance base functionality where it makes sense. Don't just go nuts because that's where you run into major problems. So coming back to the 3 points that I just mentioned, these should be our goal when we're writing CSS of any kind, not just with preprocessors. Now this is one area in which I think our thinking has changed the most in the web since 2004. And that's how we talk about CSS and how people code CSS. And methodologies and naming schemes in particular are becoming a lot more popular and are currently really talked about. And there's a new methodology, it seems, every month or so. But essentially they all share really common ground. So a CSS methodology is basically just a way of thinking about writing and structuring your CSS. And they're all about encouraging modular code, which I've mentioned quite a few times. That's about breaking things down and thinking in components and styling in components. They try to avoid undoing styles, so it's all about extending styles. So you're trying to extend components rather than make something and then have to undo styles to get your styles on top of it. So they're all about reuse as well. So reusing your components rather than making components specific to pages. And consistency, especially with naming schemes, it's all about trying to give consistency of the code you write, which is really important across teams of multiple developers as well. You want that code to look really consistent. As far as I'm concerned, if I could advise anyone writing CSS to read one book on methodologies, it would be this one, and that's Smacks by Jonathan Snook. It's been around for quite a while now, but how many people have read Smacks? Have you heard of Smacks? Okay, a few people. If you write CSS, go and read this book. It's absolutely awesome. It's not very long as well, which is my type of book, to be honest. But I actually read this about halfway through the BBC Good Food redesign. And pretty much everything in this book covered all of the problems that I faced before I had read that book. So I wish I could have gone back and read that at the start of it. So Smacks is all about making your CSS a lot more modular and easily reusable. But the book goes into a lot of detail around components and common issues people face on our larger projects especially, because the author worked at Yahoo. But those issues go back to, I use all of the stuff that I learned on that on smaller projects as well. It's really useful to learn about that kind of stuff. Now in terms of other methodologies, there's quite a few out there, and here are a few of the more common ones, the more popular ones. So you've got Smacks, which I just mentioned. Then you've got object-oriented CSS, which is all about writing classes to extend and build up components. Atomic design, which is, again, component-driven, so it's all about thinking of stuff and trying to break it down into the smallest possible thing that you can and style in that way and building up bigger components out of those styles. And then, you've got its CSS, which is all about clearly defined structure and modularity in your code. So the important thing, and here, you've got BEM and suit as well, which are naming schemes that I'll come onto in a second. And they lend themselves to all of these methodologies because of the way that they help define component-driven CSS as well. And the important thing to consider with any of these methodologies is you don't have to kind of just choose one and just go down that road and think, I'm just going to use SMACs and that's it. The idea of this and the power of them is to use them in combination and learn about them and take the bits that you associate with your projects and teams and put them into action yourself and change them a bit if you need to. And to take this even further, it can be a good idea to build up your own base projects, taking the parts of these methodologies and naming schemes and adapting them for your team. So just as a way of an example, at my last company, I worked at an agency and we built a lot of smaller projects. Some projects lasted literally weeks. Other projects would last longer. And there were about 6 of us working on these different projects. And one of the biggest problems we had was switching between projects. Obviously, someone would get pulled on or someone would go on holiday. And just knowing where stuff was. So having a consistent folder structure, file names, stuff like that was really important because you didn't want to search where this base CSS file was. It was just a waste of time, right? And the same with our Sass structure. You wanted the same sort of structure and consistency throughout all the projects. So we made a base project which was called Kickoff. And the aim of this was just literally to look through the methodologies and naming schemes, pick out the bits that we liked or change the bits that we didn't, and that was our base that everyone started from. And it wasn't like Bootstrap where it had loads of components, it was basically that structure. It's open source, so if you do want to check it out, all the links will be on the slides, but it's basically just there for structure and a simple setup with Grunt actually is built in, which I'll come on to in a bit. So like I said before, as with any kind of best practice advice, it's all about understanding and adapting it to your needs. And that's because that's where the true power lies, right? You've got to understand the things you're using and take the bits that you can apply to your projects. And it's by doing that that you'll get the true power of them. Now, one of the most obvious examples of this is with naming schemes, because naming schemes are really opinionated. Everyone can get really angry about using underscores or dashes, or I know people like BEM, which I'll talk about in a second, who don't like BEM because it uses underscores. But that's kind of not the point about BEM. The whole idea about it is to look at it, look at the conventions, and see how you can apply it yourself, because the ideas behind it are good. So naming schemes have become really popular over the last couple of years. They're heavily related to methodologies and component-driven CSS. And the idea of them is that you make it so that people's classes are quite consistent, and it's really obvious how classes relate to one another, which is really, really beneficial that I find. Like I said, they're not aimed to be restrictive. You're not trying to drag people along like this cat. You're just trying to encourage people in the same team to write CSS in the same kind of way, so that it doesn't look like if you've got 6 developers, it doesn't look like 6 people have written the CSS. You kind of have similar code inconsistencies. So there are several key aspects to naming schemes. It's to keep consistency, like I said, between class names. It's to show the relationship between classes, so that you can look at a class and look through the HTML as well and see how classes relate to one another, so that then if you see a class in the HTML that you need to change, you know what components it will impact on if you do change those styles. They make it easy to spot modified components, so you use classes to modify things, which I'll show you in a second, but it's easy to see which ones are modifying a component and which ones are meant to be like global utility classes and things like that. And they help people identify state and utility classes, like I say, because they're always consistently named. So this is the idea of BEM, which is kind of like was the daddy of them all, and other naming schemes have kind of come after it that have taken very similar things, but it's all around kind of splitting things up into clear chunks. So you have a base, which is like a block. So say on your site you've got a navigation, that might be a block. Then if you have, so your class would be nav in that example, if I was making a navigation. Then you have elements. So elements are things that live within blocks, but they're not big enough to be their own component. They have to be an element within a block. So a nav item, for example. So you know that you will always have a style on that relates to that component, and you wouldn't want to style that on its own. If you do, it would become its own component. And modifiers. So modifiers are like, say I have a very similar style of nav, and I want to set up some base styles, and then later, say I make my vertical list as my base nav, and later I want to have a horizontal list of navigation items, that's where a modifier comes in. So I'd give a modifier class, and I would make that, give it the styles that I need to make that horizontal. So just to give you a more visual example, this is some example of blocks. So this is like a header. So you have a head block, that would be a block in itself, and then you've got multiple blocks inside it, which are just basically components, right? So logo, search block, authorization block, menu block, that kind of thing. And then if you split up one of them, so the menu has multiple items. So these are then elements. So each block has multiple elements. And then modifiers. So say I had navigation in the header and the footer, I'd have a base, which would be like my nav class, and then I might have modifiers on each of them to kind of just style them just for those specific locations and styles. So looking at how this can be practically applied, this is called the Kickoff CSS naming scheme, and it's what we used to use at my old company. We actually use it at Just Eat as well. And it's very, very similar. Like I was saying about BEM, after that there was a naming scheme called Suit, and this is just a CSS naming scheme that we kind of took Suit. We didn't quite like its syntax, so we changed it a bit, and this is what we came up with, and we documented it, and it became part of Kickoff, which was great. But that's what, you guys, like I said, about the power of, understanding and changing. It's not about taking a naming scheme just because. If you don't agree with it, change it a little bit, document it, and as long as your whole team sticks to it, it's the consistency of that naming scheme that's important. So here, for example, blocks, if you have multiple words, we used camel case. Child elements, like I say, so you'd have a block like an icon list, and then if you have an element like an item, they'd always be represented with a dash. Modifier elements use double hyphens, so like I say, inline or large icon list, you'd always have a modifier class with double dash, and that's how you identify them. And element state would always have is or has. So if you ever saw is or has anywhere, you knew that that was a state class. So just to give you a really base example, it's hard to show you this without showing you lots of things, but this was something that I pulled out of Just Eat when I first got there. So we had like search results, restaurants, and like first. And if you took any of those class names and you just looked at like first, you don't really know how that relates to the actual component that it's in. And similarly with like restaurants and search results, it's quite specific to the thing that it's doing. And so it's not just the naming scheme, but thinking in a naming scheme actually helps you think about the components that you're writing. And so when you put this into a naming scheme, it becomes a lot more component driven, right? So you have like listing, which would be like the list of restaurants, but it could be a list of anything. You could have listing items. And then if you wanted to change a listing item because it was first or last, or say you wanted to highlight it, you could have dash dash, and then in this case first. And similarly, if there was a child element of the item that was in like an image, you'd signify that with a dash as well. And the good thing about this is you're lowering the specificity of each CSS class as well, which is really important because that's how it's a lot easier to override those styles a lot later. Whereas if you've got something that's 3 levels deep, that's really hard CSS to override, especially if you start using things like IDs as well, which make things even more specific. Similarly, like I showed you with the rate there was a rating class that was nested in those search results. Because you're thinking about things in components, you probably want to use a rating in other parts of the website. So you'd pull that out as its own component, and you'd actually style that as just a rating, and then if it had different things inside it, you'd have child classes on that. And states are really clear. So rather than just having active or valid, you have is active and is valid. So using a naming scheme really positively reinforces modular and component-driven CSS. And using components is a massively good idea because it helps use the C in CSS, which is cascade, right? Which sometimes people tend to forget about. And when used properly, the cascade is actually the most powerful thing about CSS. Now, I could talk about component-driven CSS all day long, but hopefully from some of the examples I've shown, and there's tons of articles out there, which I can give you guys a list to afterwards, some of them are in my slides, you've got an idea of why it's important to think about this and the consistency around the CSS. I've only really scratched the surface of it, but there are some really great books and articles out there, like I say, and SMACs, if you want to start somewhere, start there, definitely. There's another really good article, actually, that was published on SitePoint, which has an amazing name. It's called Atomic OO BEMS. And the idea of the article, again, was to kind of go through the fact that it's important that no one sticks to one methodology. You take the bits that you want and you use it as you kind of want to on your own projects. And this is a really good article kind of explaining kind of the philosophy around that. So, as a brief summary of the CSS workflow side of things, use preprocessors responsibly, draw from methodologies to help your structure, and define your own conventions for consistency. I think they're the 3 most important things with CSS workflows, really. So I've talked a lot about CSS, but I want to talk about some of the other workflow changes that I think has happened in front-end development as well. And I think one of the biggest ones that's happened since I've been working with front-end is task runners, such as Grunt and Gulp. Now, Grunt and Gulp both are task runners that are built in JavaScript, and they can automatically carry out some really useful front-end development tasks. So things like minification, concatenation, linting, setting up local servers, browser refreshing with your styles automatically in them. So who here uses something like Grunt or Gulp, for example? Awesome. I'm totally preaching to the choir. That's awesome. So I won't go through this too much, but basically I've used both of them quite extensively now. And Grunt has a lot. It's a bit older, so it's had more packages, but Gulp is actually catching up quite a lot now. And I'd say they're almost on par now, pretty much. But Gulp is insanely fast compared to Grunt, and that's simply, well, it's a lot faster, but it runs tasks in parallel. So Grunt tends to do tasks one at a time and saves files back, and then does another task after it. Gulp does things in parallel through streams, so if anyone's done stuff with Node, they'll know a lot about how Gulp works. It's also slightly more intuitive to use Gulp, I'd say, if you're coming from a front-end development background, because it's written in JavaScript. So if you know JavaScript, it's kind of very, very familiar, whereas Grunt is a lot more config-based. So the main thing to know about Grunt and Gulp is that they both run on Node, and they make use of a package manager called npm, which stands for Node Package Manager, and it comes bundled with Node when you install it. Now, as of when I wrote these slides, there were 165,274 packages on npm, which I imagine there's tons more now. So it's really widely used, and there's a ton of Grunt and Gulp packages out there. But what are the reasons for using a task runner over something like CodeKit? Because, you know, those things that I explained, like minification and linting and all of that sort of stuff, you can already do with other apps, right? So why would you use a task runner instead of them? Well, I think they help you to define a consistent workflow across your team. And I think this is the biggest reason I would use a task runner over anything else. So without using a task runner, if you want to use a preprocessor, or if you want to simply minify and optimize your CSS and JavaScript and images, you don't have a defined way of doing that. You might have a README with it documented. But you know, if you just use a tool somewhere and you just chuck your images into it, that's great. But no one else knows that you're doing that unless you document it, like I say, and then you're relying on them to read that, which is, you know, as we all know, sometimes documentation doesn't get read as much as it should do. Whereas with task runners, as soon as they pull down that repo, if you're using GitHub or SVN, they'll get a package JSON with all of the tasks in it. So if they run Grunt or Gulp, it should by default automatically run all of those tasks. And this is awesome because that means that, you know, their setup is already done pretty much, unless they need to install Node or something like that. So it's a lot easier to it's almost self-documenting in the way that you're running a task runner. For more advanced users as well, and even better, you can get the tasks to run on a build server when your code gets deployed, which is even more awesome, right? Because you're taking out human error. So rather than relying on someone to make sure that something's minified or images are optimized, this doesn't even concern you because it gets done at build time. So you write something into your deploy script with Grunt and Gulp, it automatically gets done, so there's no risk. It's just, well, not no risk, but there's much, much less risk of people not doing things that should be done in terms of front-end development. And you don't need to know Node or command line to use task runners. That's one of probably the biggest common myths, is that you have to be an expert in command line or something. You really don't. You just need to know how to install Node, which is super simple, and then write Gulp if someone set it up for you. And that's basically it. So I'm not going to go into like the full Grunt and Gulp setup. There's tons and tons of tutorials out there that do a much better job than I could in a couple of minutes of showing you how to set that up. But I would say, having used both of them, if I was starting out scratch and I wanted to learn one, I'd go with Gulp probably, just because it is a hell of a lot faster, and the way the streams work make it a lot more logical. So, you know, I use both still, but I would probably, if I had my choice, I would use Gulp still now. Now, the last thing I want to quickly cover, I'll show you a bit about a Grunt and a Gulp workflow in a second and how I use them. But I want to cover static site generators very quickly as well. So static site generators, for people who haven't used them or who might know about them a little bit, they basically take some content and they take a bunch of data, like Markdown or JSON, and a set of template files, so you might write them in handlebars or something like that, another template in language, and it combines them to give you a set of HTML files. So it's really like a simple way of being able to manage content while still being able to separate it from your HTML templates. So this is really useful for stuff like blogs, where all you really need to write is Markdown. You're not looking for multiple users to go in and edit it. So there are quite a few static site generators out there. There's a link to a full list, like there's tons. I didn't realize how many there were until I Googled it, but there are absolutely tons now. Jekyll's probably the most well-known and widely used one, and it's awesome for blogs and really simple stuff. But I would say that as you tend to get better with them and you want to do more of it, it's quite limiting. I use something called Assemble, which has got a bit bigger learning curve at the start because the documentation isn't as good as Jekyll, but I find that I can do pretty much whatever I want with it, which is awesome. Now, I actually built a tool myself based on Assemble at my old company, and a bit like Kickoff, it was built to solve a problem that we had, which was we had clients who wanted to they basically wanted text on a website without a CMS, right? So that then you get sent a bunch of Word files or something like that you had to update on a site. And I got really fed up of having to go in and style all of them with HTML rather than set it up in a CMS or something. So I started looking into static site generators to do this for us. And that way we could just use Markdown. So if someone sent some updated terms and conditions, I could just paste this into Markdown and it almost took care of itself. It was awesome. And so what statics basically does as well is we used it for that, but it actually became a tool that we could very, very quickly, because it had a workflow set up, you could just run grunt and it would automatically give you something. You could prototype in really, really quickly, and you could spin up HTML templates. So if you're making templates to send to someone else, or you're just making templates and you wanted to do it without a backend, you could do it with statics, and then you could have a header that you'd use across multiple files because it was using templating engines as well. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. We also use static site generators at Just Eat for our documentation because it's a really awesome way of linking some of the stuff that we write. Eventually what we want to do is have our HTML that's generated from our .NET. We want to somehow build it into our style guide so that if someone updates that, it updates automatically in our style guide. But the good thing about this as well is that people can just write documentation in Markdown. They don't have to write documentation in HTML or use a CMS or a wiki, which wikis are, not great. This way I can actually style my style guide really nicely because it's all in HTML, and it runs off the same CSS as the Just Eat site. So any of my style guide stuff, if someone changes a color, a base color, say I wanted to change Just Eat red and get killed by our design team, then I could do that and it would automatically update in our style guide, which I'll show you again in just a second. So I'm going to finish by attempting to just show you a couple of these examples. The other tool that's probably not too clear, but the other tool I wanted to quickly run across, I'm getting close to the microphone and I think it's going crazy. The other one I wanted to talk about as well is a tool called Yeoman. And how many people have heard of Yeoman? Used Yeoman? A few people. Yep, so Yeoman's awesome. It's a really cool tool. And it's basically a tool that if you've got a lot of projects that you work on that have changing requirements, right? So you might have a project that uses some IE8 stuff, you might support IE8. Some other projects you might want jQuery in, but some other projects you might not. You can set up Yeoman to ask you a bunch of questions, and there's ones for Bootstrap out there as well. There's a Yeoman generator for that. But basically, just to show you, we built one for Kickoff. And so basically, can everyone see that? How large shall I make it? Can everyone see that? Yeah, cool. So basically you just type in yo kickoff, which is like the way to set up a generator, and you can program it to ask you a bunch of questions, right? So here's my project name, so I'll just call that Bristech. Project description, so I'm just going to say blah. So all of the stuff that I'm putting in here actually automatically goes into my package JSON, so I don't have to change any of the config stuff. It's automatically set up to go into my code, and there's placeholders in that to automatically put these names. But the really powerful stuff is you can ask stuff like this. So you can ask if it supports IE8. And then it's linked to a bunch of files or set up in your CSS that adds the things that you might need for IE8. So I say yes. I'll move this around because it's too big. And then I can use Browserify. So if anyone doesn't know what Browserify is, it's like a JavaScript dependency manager. Sometimes you might not want it. Sometimes you might just want a JavaScript file. So we built it so that it says, do you want to use Browserify? And if you do or you don't, that's fine. It'll just go away and add the stuff that you need for it, which is awesome. It'll let you define your namespace. And then this is another really cool bit where you can add, if you're commonly used libraries like underscore and things like that, you can actually add them in. And then if you want to turn them on, it'll automatically add them to the package for you. And then if you want to have a style guide or not, you can do that. So, and basically when I hit enter through this, I won't do it now because I don't have an internet connection, but it'll go away and it'll do all the things based on the things that I've done. And it'll set up my base project with those answers. So that means if every project, I can have slightly different things that I know will be common switches between the different projects, and it will go away and give me an install. Rather than me having to go through and delete and add things, this does it all for me, which is awesome. Now, just to show you with the static stuff, I've got a base install of statics here. And just to show you how cool it can be to use static site generators for this kind of stuff. If you run grunt serve, so I've got a workflow set up, which I'll show you, if you've used grunt and gulp, this will be, completely normal for you guys. But in terms of like, it'll run Sass and all that kind of thing, but it'll spin up a local server, which is also really useful. And it'll give me, this is what is basically the default. But the really useful thing about this, like I say, is if sorry, I should have opened Sublime, and with the right command. So if I show you Sublime, and I open my index, so this is the index file. So you'll see this is just Markdown, right? So this is the good thing. Like we could write stuff like this, and equally I can just put HTML into this and have headers and footers included, and it'll automatically write this kind of stuff for me. So I'll have to run this again. Just make sure the server's running. But the good thing about this is it gave me a really quick development environment to kind of work in. So if I then changed, say I wanted to change and delete this for some reason, then if I went back to here, well, you'll see this is running in the background because it's watching all my files. But then it'll delete my list item. So this was really useful for when we developed templates as well, because it was a really quick way of getting up and running. We just downloaded statics, started building, and we were building templates like instantly, which was awesome. So it actually saved us a hell of a lot of time, and it's still being used now at my old company. Now, the other good thing about statics, like I showed you with the style guide option, it actually runs off that's the CSS all baked in as well. So you can build your templates and it automatically builds you a style guide. So it'll have stuff like logo, colors, typography, all based off your CSS. And this is similar to the sort of stuff that we're using at Just Eat, which I'll show you in a second. But this is really useful because it just gives you a base style guide. So as you start to build stuff, it shows you kind of, if you want to show this to design and that kind of thing, they can kind of look at the different visual hierarchy and that kind of thing. And it's really useful. I'm not saying use statics because that's not what I'm trying to say, but I'm trying to say static generators are really, really useful for this kind of thing and actually building up style guides that can be almost automatic to your process. The other side of things then is if I show you the Just Eat one, I have to up this again. So if I just, so this is gulp, but if I run, so we've got it set up now so that when you run gulp docs, in our Just Eat repo, it'll actually go away and it'll run all of this stuff and spin up our front-end documentation. So again, like I say, we're giving this to UX guys so that they can just write Markdown then. So all of this is written in Markdown and some of it's in HTML as well. But then we've got stuff that runs off the Just Eat code base. So this is the CSS file that we use on Just Eat, and it automatically pulls in. You'll see it's very similar to statics, like I say, but it's pulling in all the different, styles like typography and that kind of thing. And this is the sort of thing that we want to grow out and turn into almost live-in style guide. And static site generators are really useful for that kind of thing. And we started doing stuff like headers in it. And this is one area that we really want to grow it and, like I say, link into the actual HTML as well. So that was my demo. So a very, very brief summary then. So preprocessors are really good, which hopefully everyone already knows. But don't forget your CSS fundamentals. Don't go crazy with preprocessors just because. Think about why you're using them and where they can actually help you and your teams. Task runners help align teams and projects because of the config, and they're a lot better than using tools like CodeKit and things like that, in my personal opinion. Static site generators, think about how you can use them because they're really powerful. They're a really good way of quickly being able to create templates if that's what you do, but also for style guides and things like that. And aim for consistency and ease of setup. Because the biggest thing is if you create this amazing tool but no one can set it up, no one's going to use it, right? So it's got to be easy to use, and it's got to use familiar setups to, what people are used to, unless it's really good, and then, So it's really worth thinking about the ease of setup and what people have to go through to set this up. The slides are up here if you do want to download them. So that's ashn.uk exploring-r-workflows. I'll put that up in a second. But thank you very much for listening, and thanks for coming along, and I hope you've got something out of it. So yeah, thanks a lot. Any questions? No? Yes?
Found the start list that we used something that we do for the company, trying to get our designers to start together.
Yep.
What do you expect from designers in order to put a start like that together? Do you sit down and give all the elements on a page and say you can design one piece of
I think it's a cooperative thing, right? So one of the things we're doing at Just Eat at the moment is that's kind of like our first run of it. I've done style guides in the past, but it's more about finding out what's useful for them. And so, because at the end of the day, I know a fair bit, a bit about design, but designers and UXers should be leading that if I'm a front-end developer as well. So it's more about what's going to be useful for you and how you can see. The good thing about that is, like I say, it runs off the same CSS as the site. So if a designer wanted to go and look at it, they can just see exactly what's being produced. And the good thing then is if they know how to use that tool as well, they could write prototypes out of that CSS. And that's one of the things that we're doing via UXers at the moment, is we're teaching them our base framework and just giving them that tool, and then they'll be able to prototype things with our code base. So ideally, they can just do my job then, basically. But that's kind of what you want to do, right? You want to streamline it as much as possible, because previously they were using Bootstrap, and we don't use Bootstrap because we find it too big and bulky. So then they were coding stuff, and then we were recoding it, and it just doesn't make much sense. It's better for them to be coding stuff in the tools that we use. So yeah, I think it's a cooperative thing, and it's just kind of finding out what's most useful for you. And if you think having a full form laid out in a page will be useful, I think one of the most useful things from a front-end perspective is our team at Just Eat, potentially anyone can edit CSS and add to it. So one of the big things we're focusing on is that component library, because the teams are quite separated sometimes in the components they make. It's hard sometimes to know which styles, if a style's already been made. Especially with component-driven stuff, right? So having that component library, then people will be able to go in and see what's already been made, and then when people add stuff, they'll add it to the component library. And I think that's probably be the most powerful thing then, because everything will kind of be self-documented, which would be awesome. But yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
Making my Nolan generator or something, I'm quite interested in.
Yeah.
What was the process of doing that?
It's when I learned off someone else, and I thought it was really scary at the start. It's really not though. If you look up on GitHub, if you look up generator-kickoff, there's a kickoff generator, and you can look exactly, that's built in Yeoman, and you can kind of see the examples, but actually then add in stuff to it. I think the initial setup step is probably a bit of work, but once you get through that, add in stuff and changing stuff is basically like if statements. You basically say if IE8, you can set a variable, and then you just put the files in that you would want to put into a certain folder. And it's quite simple then. But Yeoman is awesome. I think it's one of the most underused tools in terms of front end. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, sure.
You mentioned that both the style guide and your application are using the same CSS.
Yep.
Do you have any recommendations on, or how do you manage to keep the markup in sync between your style guide and your application?
So that's the bit that we're working on at the moment. So yeah, at the moment we're just relying on people, if they update a component, to update it in the HTML in our style guide, because that's the problem, right? I know people like Lonely Planet have done stuff with Ruby and things like that in the past. We want to do it so that we use Razor and .NET. So I'm quite new to .NET, so I'm trying to work out a way of us being able to build Razor templates and be able to have it into our style guide. But yeah, ideally we'd have. The good thing about that then is when you build it like that is that it helps the back end become more componentized, because it's got to be for the style guide. So that's why we want to build it like that. But yeah, we haven't completely solved that yet. That's one of the things that we want to look at. But yeah, that's why that's literally probably the first run of our component guide. But yeah. Cheers. Anyone else? Cool. Oh, yep.
I'll stick one in. I'm kind of against the grain in that I don't use preprocessors, so it's probably me being really stupid. But like your example at the start, we had button and my other button. Was that not a good example of why you should just stick with vanilla CSS? I mean, that would have been really.
I personally hate extends, so yeah, you're talking to someone. I just gave. I think it's more an example of like I say, about features of Sass, and I think that's why post CSS is. We use it post CSS in conjunction with Sass. We actually use it as another step, but I think that's why post CSS is probably gaining a bit more traction, because people who didn't go to preprocessors because they think that they don't need it, they can just add one feature. Like auto prefixer for me is a massive tool, and being able to just add that is amazing. But if you might not want to use everything else that Sass gives you, so I think I think post CSS kind of is leaning on the people who didn't want to use something like a preprocessor because of the reasons like that, like you say, where it's got features that I don't think are that beneficial. But yeah. Yep. Sure.
Have you got any examples of where you might use running cross task on the server in production?
Yep. So we use Team City, and we basically have to run through where we install Gulp, and then we set up deployment tasks rather than local tasks in Gulp, so that it runs Gulp deploy, and then it will automatically spin up and do that at Just Eat. But yeah, if you get in contact, I can send you stuff over with that sort of thing. But it's basically just tasks to kind of, again, like that's something we're building up, because I joined Just Eat about 6 months ago, and we didn't used to use Sass, we used to use Bootstrap and that kind of thing, and we're changing the whole front-end process, which obviously takes time. But one of the things that we want to bring in is obviously we want to have that safety net, like I say, of making sure that when people commit images, they're always being minified, and that's why we have Gulp on our server, basically. Yeah. Cool. All right, thank you very much. Cheers.